A Mexican problem is not supposed to become an American problem.
By 2040, Anglos will be less than 25% of the whole.
They are 42 million, taking to the streets and demanding legalization for over 12 million undocumented aliens currently living in the United States. The immigration issue took center stage during the months of April and May 2006, energizing the passions and prejudices of the nation. It couldn't have occurred at a worse time since the country is struggling with its own identity and future. The motor behind such historic demonstrations was House Bill 4437, approved by the U.S. Congress on December 15, 2005.
People that have come into this country in violation of federal laws have been marching that they be treated justly. There was a law that was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives that would make people that come here in violation of immigration laws, make them felons, jeopardizing prison time, putting them in jeopardy of being sent to prison. And anyone that helps them, attorneys included, would also be liable as a felon.
When we saw in Los Angeles those 500,000 illegal aliens and their supporters going through the streets, I have never failed to find the communist influence. I have never failed to find the Che Guevara flag that they take with them. And I'm going to tell you what the media is not telling you. You're not just looking at people that want the laws changed and to make themselves legal. You're looking at a revolution.
Never before in the immigration history of the United States has one specific ethnic group attained such demographic proportions.
In the United States, we've gone through 4 great waves of immigration in our history. The first wave, of course, was the wave of settlement, the first Europeans coming here. The Spanish were among the first immigrants to arrive in today what is the United States. The English, the Dutch. So that was the first wave, which lasted from the 17th century, the 18th century.
Today, portions of U.S. society feel seriously threatened by the newcomers. Issues of labor, laws, social interaction, health, and language are still on the table.
But starting in 1880, the federal government began to want to control immigration. The first big immigration act was the Chinese Exclusion Act, saying we cannot have any more Chinese coming here. And that was because California was putting pressure on the federal government to regulate and stop the influx of Chinese who were coming to California to build a railroad. It was xenophobia, it was racism. We need them to work and to build a railroad, but we don't want them to bring any women. It was strictly only men. And we don't want them ever to settle here and become citizens and members of our society. So the Californians were very afraid of being overwhelmed with Chinese. I mean, there was discussion about the yellow peril, the fear of too many Asians coming. And this extended also, by the way, to the Japanese. But it was specifically the Chinese who were targeted.
There is a long and repeated history of using immigrants as scapegoats for other problems that a country faces. Going back to the 18th century, when no Irish need apply, when we were afraid of the influx, the in-wave of Italian communities, and then the problems became the same concerns. They were afraid that those immigrants didn't assimilate.
The fear of losing the national sense has always been a constant concern in the history of the United States. In fact, a few laws were passed during the first quarter of the century to provide some type of assurances that Americans would remain faithful to the ethnic composition of the first settlers.
After World War I, the decision was made that this is too risky, too dangerous to have all of these people coming from Eastern Europe or Italy. There's still some fear of too many Catholics. There's also, of course, fear of too many Jews. So in 1924, the Congress passed the most sweeping immigration law in American history, which was the National Origins Quota Act. And what the 1924 law tried to do is it tried to make sure that America is going to look in 1920s, 1930s, it's going to look like it did in 1890. Naturally, this favors Britain, it favors Sweden, Scandinavia, Norway, Germany, North, West Europe. It's strictly a racist law. It's an attempt to freeze, the American society and the ethnic composition of American society, to make it look like it did at some previous point in time. The National Origins Quota law began to break down after World War II. If you go back and you read the famous manifesto by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, if you go read Mein Kampf, there's a few pages in Mein Kampf where Hitler says the Americans have the best idea, the best immigration law, which is to preserve this white Aryan race, to preserve a pure people. So it doesn't look good for the United States to have such a racist law.
In 1942, as a result of the United States entering the Second World War, a serious labor shortage prompted the U.S. to negotiate with the Mexican government to hire Mexican laborers on a seasonal basis to harvest crops. The initiative is commonly known as the Bracero Program, and the logic behind it was to have the laborers come to the States, work, and then return to Mexico. Around 4 million Mexican workers participated in the program, and for 21 years they provided a solution to the need for cheap labor in agriculture. But things didn't work as planned, and more than a third of the braceros took root in America, finding new job opportunities in the Promised Land and making the United States their new country.
That in 1954, when it was clear that there were lots of Mexicans who were coming to the United States as guest workers and they were not going back home, they were staying here, we had something in 1954 called Operation Wetback. The government sent the police into the barrios, and they detained about 1.5 million people, and over a period of time, and these people were simply put onto buses. They were taken to Mexico across the border, and so after World War II, you cannot separate the fate of African Americans, black Americans, from immigrants, because you have the beginning of a very strong civil rights movement starting in the 50s, and you have the Cold War, where the United States now is locked into a great ideological struggle with the communist enemy. And the feeling is it doesn't look good for us not to be practicing what we are preaching.
So I would probably argue that these two things sort of converge on immigration policy. The Vietnam War and our domestic civil rights revolution helped to bring about this major historical shift in our immigration policy in 1965, where President Johnson then begins to say, we're going to widen America out as far as immigration is concerned. No longer is it going to be European-centered, which is the way it was for the good part of the early 20th century.
The Hispanic presence in the U.S. was not truly noticeable until 1970, when, according to the census, over 9 million people of Hispanic descent were found living in the United States. Then, between 1970 and 1980, the Hispanic population grew by 61%, some of which may have been caused by the exodus of people trying to avoid the civil strife engulfing the Central American countries, or the Cubans trying to avoid a communist dictatorship. But most credit the growth to the high fertility rate among Latinos living in the United States. Under the influence of Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, several guerrilla troops flourished throughout Central America. Thousands of people were displaced or killed, while thousands more sought refuge in the United States. In 1980, the U.S. witnessed the effects of extreme social and economic pressure by the Cuban government, prompting and allowing more than 125,000 Cubans to escape in what is remembered as the Mariel boat lift. To make things even worse, in 1982, the Mexican economy almost collapsed, with the Mexican peso reaching a rate of exchange of 3,000 pesos to the dollar. For millions of Mexican citizens, reaching the United States seemed the only viable solution for survival. In the meantime, the U.S. economy boomed, and the private sector cashed in on the cheap labor offered by millions of immigrants, legal or not. It was these conditions that finally prompted the U.S. Congress in 1986 to reform its immigration policies. Under President Reagan's administration, a new law was enacted imposing severe penalties to businesses that employed illegal aliens and offered amnesty to those already in the country. The purpose of the law, in theory, was to stop the flow of illegal immigrants. However, for one reason or another, the main purpose of the reform, that referring to employer sanctions, was never enforced.
You might as well have a sign on our border, "Welcome Mexicans," because they have been welcomed. There has been no enforcement of our laws whatsoever.
Of course, more money was allocated to the Border Patrol, but the crossing of the southern border was just half of the story. In fact, today it is estimated that around 50% of the undocumented aliens living in the U.S. arrived legally, with appropriate visas either as tourists, students, or temporary workers. Once here, they didn't return to their home countries. By the 1990s, more than 22 million Hispanics, mostly Mexicans, were living in the U.S. The immigrant wave appeared unstoppable, and certain sections of the U.S. started looking more like Chihuahua and Nuevo Laredo than American cities. Traditional Mexican holidays like Cinco de Mayo and 16th of September were celebrated with U.S. officials participating in parades surrounded by hundreds of Mexican flags. The growing numbers of the Hispanic population continued to be fed by legal and illegal immigration. More alarming than the immigration factor was the high birth rate. The typical Hispanic family was double the size of the white and non-Hispanic population. When George Bush ascended to the presidency of the United States in 2000, over 35 million Hispanics were living in the States. Millions of Americans were taking advantage of the availability of cheap labor performed by Hispanic immigrants. Restaurants, factories, farms, and households needing nannies or gardeners were also using the reliable and inexpensive labor offered by Latinos aspiring to achieve the American dream. Many of the American employers who were taking advantage of the cheap labor were also, conveniently, ignoring the legal status of their contract help. With the heightened sense of public awareness, there appeared to be a general consensus that some type of accord would be necessary to create a path to legalization for the millions of illegal immigrants already living in the country. That consensus disappeared suddenly when the United States was ferociously attacked on September 11, 2001, causing a major shakeup in America. The concern of security was the war cry of many, with fears and xenophobic feelings against minorities, especially Hispanics. As Hector Flores, leader of LULAC, cautioned,
"But we know that of the 19 terrorists that came here, not a single one of them came over the Mexican border from Central or South America.
For those concerned with our national identity, the revelation resulting from the 2000 census was shocking.
Every attack or attempted attack perpetrated on our homeland in recent history was carried out in full or in part by illegal aliens. There should be no debate on illegal immigration. It presents a clear and present danger.
Latinos were invading America. Bilingual education, Spanish newspapers, TV ads in Spanish were everywhere. The porous southern border now represented a clear and imminent danger to the American status quo.
You can read Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. You can read any globalist Wall Street Journal editorial. You will not find any rationale or reason why a country like the United States, as a post-industrial information superpower, should be importing large numbers of low-skilled, poorly educated people.
With the political changes in Mexico and the election of Vicente Fox of the National Action Party, Mexico offered an olive branch to its citizens living in the north by providing Mexican citizenship for those individuals whose parents were of Mexican descent. This single action was to foster a stronger connection between families divided by the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexico noticed the positive impact to their GNP of the large amount of U.S. dollars being sent to Mexico, to the tune of several $billion annually. In 2003 alone, immigrants sent $12.3 billion to Mexico, an increase of 36% compared to 2002. In 2005, that figure was closer to $20 billion. Hate mongers aside, the concern of thousands of undocumented aliens penetrating the country by the southern border was in most instances genuine. Annually, more than 1 million undocumented immigrants try to enter the United States by the southern border. Nearly 500,000 of them succeed. Most are Mexican, but these are intermixed with a large percentage of Central Americans. There have been documented instances of Afghans, Arabs, and Chinese citizens crossing illegally. The U.S. shares nearly 2,000 miles of borders with Mexico. In Texas, the boundary is defined by the Rio Grande. Then to the west, a very rough terrain of desert and sand hills, interrupted unevenly by several border crossings and bridges in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The economic and social differences between the two countries are exposed with only a glance from Mexico to the U.S. From the south side of the imaginary line of demarcation, Mexicans can look to the north at the land of opportunity, and this seems to be a very powerful magnet. In the urban areas of the crossed road, the U.S. government has installed large structures of metal walls made of discarded helicopter pads. Powerful video cameras monitored 24 hours a day by the Border Patrol officers are watching every movement on both sides of the fence. Border Patrol vehicles are always present. Meanwhile, on the rough areas of the desert in Arizona or California, fences reinforced with metal bars are a hopeful deterrent against vehicles crossing.
This is what the fence looks like, the barbed wire, or the 5-6 strand barbed wire fence. You can see where they've used it before, where they've come across it right here, this area. You can see that there's trails here.
Cameras mounted on large towers on the hills are also watching. Then there are the sensors, and the planes, and more guards, and now the National Guard or the Minutemen.
The obstacles that people face when they cross the border are so many. Well, one of the obstacles that they face is initially when they get to the border, before they cross the border, they can get robbed on the Mexican side of the border by bandits. They can get robbed on the north side of the border as they cross by bandits, by Mexican bandits. They have to contend with the heat out here, the intense heat in the summer. They have to contend with the intense cold out here in the dead of winter. The lack of water, or even just the little water that they carry for such a long journey of 40 plus miles. They also have to contend with the number of agents that are working out here, that the probability of getting arrested is going to be high, with not only agents on the ground but agents up in the helicopters, the agents using infrared scopes, night vision equipment out work in this area. The cameras that exist, not only in the infrared cameras but in the urban areas like in Nogales, where they have the remote video surveillance systems that watch the whole border area, and the ground sensors, and even the vehicle sensors that will detect a vehicle driving through an area.
Those who risk reaching a large city where they could mingle with the native population face 3 days of walking on a very hostile environment with harsh vegetation. Just in the Tucson sector of Arizona, 2,600 border agents are watching. Annually since 2001, an average of 200 undocumented aliens, mostly from Mexico, have perished in the desolation of the Arizona desert.
And another memory that I have of crossing the border is finding a dead man under the bushes. And that was shocking for me because, I was 10 years old and I had never seen a dead person. And when I first discovered this man, I thought he was sleeping. The man had died trying to cross the border, that he had been bitten by a snake, and his smuggler, the person that was taking him across the border, left him there in the middle of the border, hoping that the immigration patrol was gonna find him, and they never did find him.
Pues fueron 10 días encerrado en un vagón de tren, veníamos 22 personas, varios se desmayaron, duramos 3 días sin comer porque desengancharon los vagones del tren, la mitad del tren a mitad de camino, no sé por qué razón, y estuvimos 3 días encerrados. El coyote que nos echó en el vagón le cerró por fuera con los clavos del mismo tren, le selló para que no nos saliéramos, para que no pudieran abrir y nos encontraran ahí. Al llegar a Fort Worth, se supone que alguien nos esperaba y le quitaba esos clavos y ya salíamos nosotros. Pero se esperaba que llegáramos en un día y medio, pero tardamos 10 días para llegar.
But it was a horrible experience anyway, knowing that you are crossing the country, hiding, even though you haven't committed any crime, but you feel like a criminal because you feel like at any moment you can be haunted and who knows what can happen to you. I mean, when you come, you cannot be sure about what is going to happen to you. And so the first time, I remember I tried, and it was just crossing the border and then trying to catch a plane, which on the other side of the border, which it was not possible. The second time we tried was again crossing the Rio Grande and then hiding into a trunk of the car and passing the checking points. After probably 5 minutes, when we passed the checking point, we heard sirens and we feel the car stopping. And so completely stops, and we hear some conversations that I couldn't understand because I didn't speak any English at all at that time. But it was very, very terrifying because I thought that in any second the trunk was going to be open and then our ordeal going to start all over again, that we were going to be sent back to Mexico and that we will start the whole thing over. So the trunk never opened. the car, all of a sudden this conversation stopped and the car started again moving. And that was like a relief because, I mean, we knew that we were still safe somehow. So a few minutes later, the car stopped again, the trunks open, and the drivers tell us that the police was looking for a car with the same characteristics of the cars that we were driving.
We are a nation of immigrants. We have been a nation of immigrants for over 2 centuries. And it's not like we were a nation of immigrants for 230 years, but now we're going to be something else. It's what's made this country so great.
We need to understand that the folks who are here already came to work hard. They are building America, and they should be respected because of it.
Latinos today represent around 14% of the U.S. population, and there's no doubt that Hispanics have made serious strides incorporating themselves into American society.
There are about 5,100 Latino elected officials in the country, serving on school boards, city councils, mayors, U.S. senators, members of Congress. About 40% of all those elected officials are here in the state of Texas. The majority of Latino elected officials serve Latino majority districts, but as we have seen the increase of Latino elected officials, they're coming from non-Latino majority jurisdictions and states. For example, we had 3 U.S. senators. New Jersey is not a majority Latino state. Colorado is not a majority Latino state, yet both have elected Latino senators. Florida is not a Latino majority state. They have elected a Latino senator. Los Angeles is not a majority Latino city, at least not yet, and they have a Latino mayor. So what we are seeing in this new decade is the crossover Latino candidate, the candidate that's able to attract Latino and non-Latino votes, and to show that there are Latinos and Latinas that are able to provide leadership for all Americans.
The Latino workforce plays a very important role in the U.S. economy. More than 20% of the agricultural labor is performed by Hispanics. In the construction sector, it is 17%, while in services the percentage is around 24%. Moreover, just between 1990 and 2003, the undocumented Hispanic workforce contributed $520 billion into Social Security. Half of that amount came from the agricultural and service jobs. Latinos are also an integral part of the U.S. Armed Forces. Just as an example, 85,000 Hispanics have served in Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. While in the 80s, Hispanics were concentrated primarily in the southwestern states, with the major concentration in California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida, today the Latino presence is getting strong in virtually any state of the Union. Because all this growth has been a very recent phenomenon, without time for assimilation, Spanish is very present in those states. In cities like Los Angeles and Miami, some of the Spanish TV stations get larger ratings than mainstream English television networks. To serve a population of about 1.5 million Latinos, more than 15 radio stations inundated the airwaves of Dallas, Texas. In 2005, for the first time ever, a Spanish radio station became the #1 station in the Dallas area, beating the traditional and popular English broadcasters. Latino newspapers and magazines from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco are flourishing as they serve a population that needs to rely on media that speak their language.
The need about Hispanic media had been growing proportionally as the Hispanic population increases. In order to function correctly in society, Hispanic need information in their language like any other ethnic minority. The Hispanic media serves as a transition into assimilation. Almost 1,000 publications from daily and weekly newspapers to glossy magazine and yellow pages in Spanish are helping the Spanish-speaking community. There are also more than 500 radio stations and around 100 TV stations to satisfy the need of the community.
We estimate that there are approximately 2 million Hispanic-owned businesses in the United States. It's predominantly, the demographics that we know show that the predominant business segment of Hispanic business owners are Mexican. And with definitely, there's lots of influences there from, obviously Cuban and Dominican business owners, but the majority would be Mexican.
Corporate America has been taking note, and today it is very common for large U.S. companies to cater in Spanish to this segment of the population.
I've definitely seen a change in the way corporate America responds to the Hispanic market. There have been a lot of corporations that have focused on the market and the market's potential growth and spending power. We in particular in the airline industry know that the Hispanic market is a very strong market, it's a very loyal market. It's a market you have to build trust upon. So it takes time to make that investment as well as do it continuously over time. So it's a commitment. So I've definitely seen a change where corporate America has seen that. They want the Hispanic market. They want the Hispanic market to spend their money with them.
Perhaps it is this prevalence of Spanish that scares off some segments of American society.
It's a number your government will not fess up to. We have approximately 30 million illegal aliens from 130 nations currently occupying U.S. territory. No one knows who they are, where they are, or what their intentions are, but we know they have no intention of leaving, nor do they have any intention of assimilating into our society.
And it seems that the proper opportunity to vent these fears and prejudices came with the terrorist attacks against the United States.
And we want to change, secure the borders now, and deport illegal aliens. Stop giving our money to people that hate America and come here with their hand out. Stop it! I want to say this to the press. When you go home tonight and write your article or put it on TV or maybe write it tomorrow morning for the paper, whenever you do it, if you put in that article that we are anti-immigrant, you are lying bastards. I hate Cinco de Mayo.
Despite the repeated affirmation that the movement to secure the borders is not about race, several groups and individuals are very concerned with the new face of America, a face that is brown, yellow, black, and of course white. In 2003, Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University published his book, Who Are We? The book argues that if the current pace of immigration from Mexico and Latin America continues, America is in clear danger of losing its creed, its sense of nation. Huntington asserted that Mexicans and Latinos do not assimilate. Hence, they are a threat to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant concept of the United States.
Most of the people that I see and I work with and I'm around, they're only here trying to make a better life for their families. And they become as American as apple pie as any other immigrant group that has come to this country. They love the American flag. They love everything American. They love American history. They don't forget where they came from, and they respect the countries they come from.
All we want to do is be good Americans. That's all.
Because I represent a lot of families and family cases. I represent a lot of juveniles in juvenile court. And the biggest problem that we have is not that they can't speak English, is that these children are losing their ability to speak Spanish. They are, as soon as they're born here or brought here, they are turning into Americans. A lot of folks that I know that are second generation, third generation Mexican Americans lose our ability to speak Spanish. And so I think the allegation that we're losing our senses as a nation is false. It's not true.
I believe, though, that the Hispanic culture is not so much different than the American culture. So I believe it can fit in and they can accommodate themselves very well. It is mostly a Christian civilization that they come from, and that I think is very important as well. So there is no great clash of cultures there. There is a language clash, but I think that's being accommodated very well also. The culture doesn't seem to be all that much different from the culture, the dominant culture in America.
We've been integrating for 500 years. Ever since Cortés landed in Mexico and the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth Rock, Latinos and as mestizos, Indians and Spanish have been integrating with America. America came to us, and whether you are in El Paso, San Antonio, or California, Colorado, we've been becoming part of America for the last 150 years. The reality is every immigrant who comes to this country wants to become part of the American dream, part of the American family. They believe what the Statue of Liberty stands for. And that's what we need to work for, is to mainstream the immigrants, make them learn English, get them to learn the Pledge of Allegiance, serve our country, pay their taxes, follow our laws.
I see absolutely no data that shows that Latinos don't assimilate. It's quite the opposite. Latinos are following the tradition of all of other immigrant groups. In fact, if you study the Latino community, you'll see that by the third generation, English has replaced Spanish.
The Hispanic influence in the United States is a very recent phenomenon, less than 40 years. And in that period of time, the Latino demographic numbers skyrocketed. What that means is that the normal time of assimilation is just arriving. Moreover, the history of immigration in the U.S. shows that by the third generation, immigrants already are almost totally assimilated to their new country, and factors of language and culture are being left behind. Nevertheless, a growing concern about security and illegal immigrants galvanized the U.S. legislature by the end of 2005. The first serious attack came from the House with a bill that basically concentrated on enforcement at the border, especially the south border, and severe sanctions against employers and whoever helps an undocumented alien. By January 2006, President Bush offered what has been a theme of the White House: comprehensive immigration reform, including not only security, but also a plan to allow most of the 12 million undocumented foreigners currently living in the U.S. to obtain some type of legalization.
We, as a country, are not going to deport 12 million people.
I will not be an Irish American, African American, Mexican American. I will be an American.
Conservative TV and radio talk show hosts began an offensive against the administration plan to legalize the undocumented aliens. It was then, under this serious threat, that the Hispanic community took to the streets. The Latino factor came into play.
Principles that all men are created equal. In the past few decades, millions of people have left their loved ones and chosen to come to America. They were invited here by thousands of U.S. employers and companies. Yet today, these new American pioneers, almost 12 million, are treated as second-class citizens. They're treated with disrespect, low wages, and cannot even get a driver's license, cannot even have the dignity of being able to apply for the American citizenship or legalization. So what we are here today, la razón que marchamos aquí es porque todos queremos ser americanos. Who wants to be an American? America, we will not turn back. América, no regresamos para atrás. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos hasta que seamos americanos. We will be here and we will stay here until we all have a chance and the opportunity to become Americans. America, today we also have a dream. And that dream may be in Spanish, but it is the same dream of Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King. It is a dream that the Statue of Liberty has held for millions of immigrants throughout the history of America. Those immigrants today who are cleaning Ground Zero in New York, who are in New Orleans cleaning Katrina after the Katrina cleanup, who are building Dallas right now, all those skyscrapers, hechos a mano por ustedes, built by us. We are building America.
No one disputes the fact that the U.S. has the right to protect its borders, and even more, its identity, whatever that is. Latinos in the U.S. are an integral part of the American way of life. They are here to stay, to enrich American society, and as any other ethnic group, assimilation is a matter of time. In the end, history repeats itself in unexpected ways.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.